Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Have you ever heard of this Sallow man? That's what Timmy Morrison asked me in 7th grade. Timmy was my best friend. We did nearly everything together. It was Friday, and we were sitting in lunch period discussing what we were going to do when he came over to stay the night after school. Now, what the hell is that? I asked him, rolling my eyes because I figured this was going to be another one of Timmy's stories that his sister told him. Timmy's face put on that look he'd always put on when he was talking about something that someone hadn't heard of before. My sister told me about him. She said he comes to you if you say some words in front of a mirror. I don't remember it all, but I wrote it down what she told me. I figured we could try it out at your house. I rolled my eyes to make it seem like I thought it was childish, but in truth I was interested. Creepy stuff like that always interested me. Even though I knew it wasn't real, I just liked hearing the stories. I didn't want Timmy to know that I wanted to hear about it, though, because then he'd just have something to be smug about. Is this just more of that Bloody Mary crap, where she just comes out of the mirror to kill you? I asked him, pretending to pay attention more to my mashed potatoes than the conversation. No! The Sallow man comes out of the mirror after you recite his poem, then he kills anyone you ask him to. That's what my sister said, anyway. Timmy said as he turned to eat his own tray. There was a poem involved, I thought. Now I really did have to know more. What do you mean, what poem? I asked him. Timmy lazily reached into one of his many folders that he carried around for school and pulled out a piece of paper that was a bit crinkled. He slid it over to me on the cafeteria table, and I examined it without picking it up. This is what it read. In dark halls within the after, from those halls you hear my laughter. Dark thoughts entreat your mind, to for now break down my bind. I will take what ails you in this land, and I will leave no trace, for I am Sallow man. I nearly laughed as I read the last lines. I was up for anything spooky, sure, but this was really corny. Timmy, you don't really believe this crap, do you? Your sister was probably just messing with you. Timmy didn't say anything at first. He just concentrated on his tray for a moment. Then he said, Brandon, do you remember last year when my parents were fighting a lot? My dad was drinking all the time, and I stayed over at your house nearly every night for a while. Of course, I remembered that. Timmy was over at my house every night. My parents allowed it because they knew what was going on. It was a small town. Everyone did. Yeah, Tim, I remember. I said, the mood now solemn. My dad hit my mom a lot, and whenever me or my sister was home, he would call me a bastard and he would call my sister a whore. It was a nightmare. I could sense Timmy's gaze turn towards me, so I looked up from my tray as well. He stared at me for a moment, wanting for me to say something, so I did. I thought your dad stopped drinking, though, and everything was okay. I asked, trying to lighten the mood a bit. Timmy responded then, with anger starting to edge into his voice. Yeah, he stopped drinking, but nothing got better. Well, sure, he stopped hitting Mom, but she barely speaks to him or anyone else in the house anymore. I know it's because of him. I know she's still afraid of him. I was a bit shocked. Timmy had never mentioned anything about that before. I just figured once Timmy started staying at his house again, everything was fine. So what are you going to sick the Sallow man on your dad? To me, that's nuts. It's just some story your sister probably heard from one of the other seniors, I told him. But what if there's a chance it would work? I need to try, Brandon. But I want you to be with me." Timmy looked dead serious. "I don't know, Tim. It just seems silly." I told him. "Please, Brandon. I need you there. Please." Timmy gave me a look of pure desperation, and I felt sorry for him. I decided that I'd be there to support him. He lived in a broken home, and he was grasping at straws. I knew it couldn't be good for him, but he was my best friend. What choice did I have? "Okay, Tim, I got your back. Let's summon a ghost." The next thing I knew, it was after school, and Timmy and I had locked ourselves in my small downstairs bathroom at home. "Do the lights need to be off or anything?" I asked. "No, at least I don't think so. I think all I have to do is recite the poem in front of the mirror, and then he appears." Timmy pulled out the piece of paper with the poem on it that he had in his back pocket, then cleared his throat. I stood back and leaned against the wall with my arms crossed. Usually when people did this sort of thing, it was in the dark, maybe with a lit candle or two, but the lights were on, and the floral wallpaper that was all around my bathroom didn't exactly inspire fear, so I felt pretty stupid in that bathroom with Timmy. I was just thankful Mom and Dad were still at work so they didn't catch us and wonder what was wrong with their son. Timmy finally began to speak after what seemed like minutes. "In dark halls within the after, from those halls you hear my laughter. Dark thoughts entreat your mind to for now break down my bind. I will take what ails you in this land, and I will leave no trace, for I am Sallow Man." Timmy spoke loudly and clearly. When he finished, he held his breath, waiting for something to happen. At that point, I was absolutely convinced Timmy was wasting his time. I sighed and closed my eyes, waiting for him to realize the same thing. I heard him gasp, which I took to be a sound of defeat. I opened my eyes and was about to console Timmy, but then I saw the real reason he made a sound. When I opened up my eyes, I saw the mirror no longer showed our reflections, but a long dark hallway. The hallway's floor, walls, and even its ceiling seemed to be moving, undulating back and forth like the insides of some giant worm. The hallway was poorly lit by some unseen source, and at the very end of it I could see the shape of what looked like a man moving toward the mirror. For a moment, I was stuck in disbelief. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the figure in the mirror came closer, and slowly its features became clearer and clearer. It was a man, or what seemed to be a man, bald and completely naked. His skin was a pale, sickly yellow. He was skinny, so emaciated that his jaundiced skin was taut against his skeleton, and every one of his ribs were visible. With thin and lanky legs, he walked ever closer to the mirror with a shambling gait. His long, ghoulish arms dragged his knuckles along the hall as he walked, parting the undulating floor for a fleeting moment before the floor came back together. When I noticed this, I squinted my eyes to try and sharpen my vision in an attempt to see what it was that was making the floor and walls quiver like they were. The cause for the moving floor became clear as they started to move from within the mirror and out onto the bathroom. Cockroaches. The insects began to spill out of the mirror and onto the sink and floor below. That was enough for me. Timmy and I had to get out of that bathroom. I reached out for Timmy's arm and tried to pull him away, but he would not budge. He stood transfixed, his eyes glued to the mirror and the nightmare that was approaching. I tried a few more times to pull him away, shouting at him to snap out of it, but he wouldn't move. It was as if something unnatural was holding him in place and wouldn't let him go. I gave up and I turned tail, hauling ass for the door. As soon as I reached the door handle, thousands of cockroaches, moving impossibly fast, covered the handle, and immediately after the door, leaving the door unobscured completely by writhing and hissing insects, I yelled, cursing and screaming as I turned around to go for the window on the other side of the bathroom. I was silenced when I was met with the sight of a room no longer recognizable as my bathroom, but was more reminiscent of that hallway in the mirror. The walls and ceiling was covered in insects. When I looked down, I saw that the roaches covered the floor below, making only 2 small spaces where my feet stood. I dared not move then. I don't know what would happen if I were to step on one of those bugs. I had the awful thought that if I were to move at all, the insects would strip my bones completely of flesh. I lifted my head slowly to the now dimly lit room. Flashes of light would strobe here and there as the roaches crawled along the light shade of the ceiling. I could see now that 2 yellow and gnarled hands had appeared on either side of the mirror, and I knew the Sallow man had come. Timmy stood there, his eyes still wide, his stature still unmoved. I distinctly remember a smell then, a sickly smell that called to mind dirty bedpans. I had to cover my mouth and nose not to gag. Still, this didn't seem to bother Timmy whatsoever. When the awful smell came, so then did the Sallow man's head emerge from the mirror. His bald head was face downward, and his neck stretched far into the room until his head was inches in front of Timmy's face. A voice came then, a hissing voice that seemed to come from the insects and echo all around the room. "Who is the one to be taken to the after?" the voice said. Timmy moved then, for the first time since he recited the poem, by smiling a wide and unnerving grin. "My father," Timmy said, loud and clear, as if delivering the death sentence himself. In retrospect, I suppose he was. There was a murmuring sound then, as all of the insects began to vibrate loudly. Then after a moment, the insects parted and swarmed around the wall to the left of the mirror, and a man, who I recognized to be Timmy's father, rose from within the wall of swarming bugs. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. The insects were swarming him, presumably pinning him to the wall. I'm sure he'd be screaming if the cockroaches weren't covering his mouth. "This is the one to be brought into the after?" The awful hissing echo came again, entreating an answer from Timmy, and without breaking his grin, Timmy said, "Yes." As if heeding the call of Timmy's word, the insects then began swarming into Timmy's father's mouth. His eyes showed his desperate fear as thousands of cockroaches began eating him from the inside out. I would say it was gruesome, but the insects were quick with their work. They devoured every bit of Timmy's father within seconds, leaving nothing left. Had my eyes not been glued to what was happening, I might have blinked, and I would have missed it. I looked back to Timmy, who had a satisfied and almost relieved look on his face. But his look soon became one of terror as the Sallow man spoke once more. "Now, you will join me in the after, boy. Such is the price to be paid." Timmy didn't move at all, save for the horrified shock that crawled over his face. I don't know if it was terror that kept it in place, or if it was the Sallow man, but oh man, I wish I didn't see what happened next. The Sallow man lifted his head slowly, revealing a face that had no features. No eyes, no nose, and no discernible marks whatsoever as far as I could tell. The only thing there was a mouth. The Sallow man's lips, like the rest of him, were stretched tight, making his human-like and yellow teeth seem bigger than they were. Stunned into helplessness by my own fear, I could do nothing but watch as the Sallow man's jaw unhinged and stretched to an impossible size. He then reached for Timmy and grabbed him, picking him up just as easy as if he weighed nothing at all. The sallow man then shoved Timmy into his mouth whole. Just like that. Gone. Impossibly, my best friend was thrown into that awful ghoul's throat. I didn't even hear Timmy scream as the thing swallowed him. Tears were falling from my eyes freely as the sallow man closed his maw and turned his attention toward me as the insects began to retreat into the mirror behind him. Just before the sallow man disappeared behind the mirror, he smiled at me. I could feel his eyes that he did not have, burn into me. A buzzing sound filled my ears then, and I began to faint. Just before I hit the ground, I saw the sallow man duck his head back into the mirror and disappear. My mother arrived home from work at around 4 o'clock, and she found me on the bathroom floor, passed out with the door closed. When my mom woke me up, my head was hazy, and it took me a moment to recall what had happened, and it was hard to think with Mom asking over and over if I was okay. But when I remembered, I became frantic, telling her something had happened to Timmy and he disappeared, but I left out the part about the sallow man. My mother looked at me like I was crazy. "Who's Timmy, dear?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. "Mom, you know who Timmy is. He's my best friend," I yelled. "Oh, you made a new friend? What do you mean he disappeared?" I started to tell her that Timmy had been my best friend all my life. I was going to tell her that he had stayed over almost all last year, but a sinking feeling in my stomach stopped me, and I pushed past my mother to the house phone. I was going to make a call to confirm my suspicion, but I hoped on hope I was wrong. I dialed Timmy's number and his mother answered. "Hello?" I took a deep breath and asked. "Hello, is Timmy there?" I asked. "I don't know any Timmy. Maybe you have the wrong number, sweetie." Timmy's mother sounded much happier than I'd ever heard her before. It wasn't enough to stop the tears from forming in my eyes, but it did prompt the next question I asked. "Are you married?" I asked, knowing how silly it sounded, but I had to know. "No, but I don't see how that's any of your business. Does your mother know you're using the phone?" I didn't reply. I just hung up. I turned around and went up into my room. I dodged all of my mom's questions, and I went straight to bed. As I lay there, I thought hard about everything that had happened. I wondered if Timmy would want things this way. It was clear from the look of terror on his face that he had no idea he would have to pay such a heavy cost. I wondered if Timmy's sister knew about the part of the deal, if she left it out on purpose, or if she just didn't think it mattered because, after all, it was just a stupid poem. But the biggest question that I kept asking myself was, is Timmy still alive? I saw that thing swallow him whole, but was it possible, in whatever world he was in, that he was still there with the sallow man? I'd hoped not, but hopes are not. I got my answer when Monday morning came. In class, all I could do was stare at Timmy's empty seat, and it was making me sick thinking about it. I asked my teacher if I could use the restroom and was excused. I went straight to the sink once I made my way to the bathroom and turned on the tap. I turned the hot water on all the way and began to splash water onto my face. When I was done, I dried myself with a paper towel, and my eyes met the now fogged-up mirror in the bathroom. There, in the condensation, were 3 words. "Help me, Brandon."
The following happened to me 7 years ago while I was a sophomore in college, and it was my first experience with any drug other than weed. Great choice, right? There are many things in this report that are downright stupid and reckless, ranging from lack of research to reckless dosing. As I said, this was 7 years ago, and I have learned how to be responsible with drugs now. However, at the time of the report, I was a fool. In fact, this experience is the main reason why I'm extremely cautious and heavily research any drug I'm interested in taking to this day. I first heard about salvia a year before this experience from a friend who lived down the hall from me in my dorm. He described it as a legal psychedelic. It's legal in Oregon and available in almost any smoke shop. That was super fun and a lot like weed. Those who know how wrong this is are probably rolling their eyes about now. I tried it a few times at parties in a social setting, usually in a circle of people. Again, stupid, I know. I never experienced any effects other than slight spinning and loss of balance, mainly due to the fact that we didn't know how to smoke it properly. We used these shitty small pipes, didn't hold in the hits long enough, and didn't really know what to look for. Fast forward 1 year later. I was at the local smoke shop in my town buying a new glass bong, my first real piece. Since I was out of weed, I decided to pick up a gram of 20x salvia as well, since I wanted to test this new masterpiece out, although I had not the slightest clue what 20x stood for at the time. Remember, at this point, I thought it was kind of like weed, but made you dizzy, giggly for a few minutes. I tried a few times in the preceding week, but didn't experience any effects other than what I described above, likely due to my failure to hold in the hits and my poor bowl lighting technique. I still thought this was fun. Eventually, I had most of the pack of salvia emptied with enough for one large bowl left. I decided the following day would be a fun time to try it out and got some rest. I woke up early the next day and went on a bike ride with my friends who, for the sake of anonymity, I'll refer to simply as S, T, and R. We got back, and after relaxing for a bit, I decided to finish off the bag of salvia once and for all. What a waste of money this was, I thought. With the exception of R, none of my friends were interested, so he and I stepped out into the garage and I sat down at the stairs and got everything ready. Next to the stairs is an old wooden fence lined with saplings and one big tree. Behind it is my neighbor's field, which had a bunch of little kids in it, running around and screaming playfully. I packed the bowl, a big bowl piece, mind you, to the brim with the remaining salvia 20x extract. My friend R was too scared to try it, since he'd heard from others about its potential to create nightmarish effects. Yeah, right, I thought. So, he agreed to sit and watch me. Here goes nothing. I leaned down and torched the bowl as hard as I could. The bong filled up with way more smoke than my old pipe ever could, and I torched about half the bowl in a single hit. Since this was the last of it, I decided to hold the hit as long as I could in order to maximize the effects, which is why it finally worked. After about 35 seconds, I exhaled and noticed I was feeling weird as fuck. So, like any sane 18-year-old who had no idea what they were doing, I torched the rest of the bowl in one gigantic hit and cleared the chamber, then held it as long as I could. After I exhaled for the second time, R asked me how I was feeling or if it was bunk again. I tried to ask him how come he was talking so weird, but all that came out was slurs. At this point, my vision started chopping, like everything around me was being rendered by a flipbook. I finally managed to say, "Oh, shit. I'm gonna need a minute." R could tell something was up, so like a good friend, he went inside to watch TV while I proceeded to lose my mind. The last thing I remember of this reality was R walking past me, back into the house. At that point, everything was just starting. As I said before, everything in my field of vision slowed down and was being chopped up. I moved my hand in front of my face and could see that it wasn't actually moving in front of my face, but that it was actually being drawn across my field of vision like an animation or a flip book. This is hard to describe. The best I can say is, imagine it as a flip book. With each frame, the hand moved a little bit more across my vision, but it wasn't actually moving. It was being rendered. As soon as I realized this, I understood that I was watching reality being created instant by instant, and it isn't a constant stream of conscious like we perceive. Weird? Huh, I know. Imagine how I felt. As soon as this realization came upon me, I heard an incredibly high-pitched squeal and experienced the feeling of impending doom. Like something of epic importance was happening. It was at this point that I completely forgot I had smoked salvia at all. Everything that happened after this was legitimately happening. Or so I thought. And my reality was falling to pieces. I closed my eyes, thinking this was too much to handle. As soon as I did, I was in another world. The prior 2 minutes of my life were laid out in front of me like snapshots, with each picture representing a single instant in time. The pictures were being flipped to demonstrate the effect I mentioned above, that flipbook effect, and show how reality was being created. The picture then split apart, and I was shown what existed behind existence, what is actually happening behind the curtain of our day-to-day lives, and at this point, I had no memory of my life at all. As soon as the pictures split, I was sucked into the space between them, which I was told by some disembodied female voice that I could not place, that this was the place between moments. We perceive life as a continuous stream, but in actuality, reality is completely destroyed and recreated between each instant. In other words, each instant is a page of the flipbook, and the previous page is destroyed and replaced with a new one. These pages were being flipped by an enormous wheel, which was the source of the noise I heard earlier. I could feel this wheel pressing up against me, threatening to destroy me and replace the current me with the me from the next moment. Naturally, I was horrified, and for some reason, filled with a sense of déjà vu. I knew I'd been there before, which was weird because this was the first time I really smoked salvia. I cannot stress how powerful and massive this wheel seemed. It was the source of reality as we knew it, responsible for creating the universe around us, and it was touching me. The voice then told me that this wheel and this space is the only thing that truly exists. Reality as we know it is merely a side effect of the action of this wheel. My consciousness has existed in this space for all of eternity, being ground against this wheel, spinning with it and helping it create reality. I somehow escaped it years ago, which coincided with my physical birth, but now it somehow got me back where I belonged. I felt utterly hopeless. My entire life had been a temporary escape into a dream in order to cope with being merely a cog in the wheel, both literally and metaphorically. And now that that illusion was broken, I was trapped here again. And the entire life I lived was merely a dream. All of my friends and family, as well as any experiences I remembered, never really happened. They were just a cheap trick I used to distract myself. This was real existence. The feminine voice told me that everyone around me are her children, and our purpose was merely to spin with this wheel and create reality. I looked around confused and realized then that I was surrounded by trillions of other little people like me, all of them trapped and spinning in order to create reality. I looked around confused and realized that I was surrounded by trillions of other little people like me, all of them trapped and spinning in order to create reality. They all screamed at me, "Help us! Help us! Help us! Spin! Stay! Stay with us! Now that you are here, you cannot leave! You cannot leave! You cannot leave! You cannot leave! You will never leave! You are us, and we are you! It has always been this way, and it always will!" These were her children, and I was her child as well. I had escaped. But now, I was back. Naturally, this scared the shit out of me. I was in hell. I was always in hell. I just forgot. I was trapped there for what felt like an eternity. Time had no meaning in that place. Each second felt like countless years. Slowly, I began to forget my life on Earth. It was a dream, as far as I was concerned, and it felt like I was forgetting it in the same way you forget a dream minutes after waking. I was dysphoric and terrified and resigned myself to spinning for the rest of eternity. After what felt like thousands of years, who knows? In eternity, nothing means anything. 1% of infinity is still infinity. I remember that I had somehow escaped into the dream world and normal Earth reality in the past, and maybe I could do it again. I didn't think I could get back into my old life, but maybe I could escape. And as the woman told me, be born again. Anything, even starting over in another life, would be better than that hell. I managed to turn my head to look at the wheel head on, desperately trying to see how I escaped it in the past. I managed to turn my head so that I was looking at the wheel from the side, the flat side, so that it resembled a spinning two-dimensional circle. The wheel was divided up into slices like a pizza or the wheel on Wheel of Fortune. The pieces were broad at the top and narrowed closer to the center. Each slice was a different color, and the edges were incredibly jagged and multi-hued. There were an infinite amount of slices, and the wheel was spinning infinitely fast. This made perfect sense in Salvia space. In the face of infinite time, after all, what is infinite space? Each slice whizzed by my face so closely that I could feel them pulling my face and grinding it down to my bones with an effect that felt almost electric. This felt pleasant compared to having my body constantly torn to pieces for all eternity on the other side of the wheel. As each slice rolled by, I stared intently at them. Slowly, I began to realize what I was seeing. The slices were moving so quickly that it took a while. Each slice was a moment in time belonging to someone in the dream world, Earth's reality, that is, and maybe I could use them to escape. As soon as I thought this, the female voice spoke to me again. She told me that escape was useless, and that even if I managed to escape into reality again, my return there was inevitable, either through death or by being stupid enough to smoke salvia again. I began to desperately claw at the wheel, trying to squeeze myself into one of the slices in the hope of inhabiting one of the bodies I saw represented. However, the wheel was spinning too fast, and when I touched it, It felt like electricity coursing through my body. Very, very painful. I fought through the pain and clawed at the wheel more and more until very briefly, the wheel appeared to stutter and slow. Hope surged through me and I began to claw harder, which caused the electric grinding feeling to increase, but I didn't care. I pulled and pulled until the wheel slowed down enough for me to look at each slice individually. As I pressed each slice, I temporarily became the person in the moment the slice belonged to. I became an alcoholic old man sitting on a couch watching TV, wishing his children were still around. I became a young girl, talking on the phone with her friends. I became a father, screaming at his children, looking at his kids cowering in the corner of his kitchen. I became a junkie in an alleyway, waiting for someone to walk by so I could rob them. Each slice belonged to a person, and as I moved my hand up and down the slice, I went through their life. The top of the slice, the broad part near the edge, was the beginning of that person's consciousness, and the tip, in the center of the wheel, was the end. Their death. Moving left to right on the slice represented the different realities that person existed in based on the decisions they made. This is why the slice was broad at the top and thin at the bottom. At the beginning of one's life, they have an endless amount of paths to choose, and as they get older and closer to death, there are fewer and fewer paths to take that can steer them away. I realized that each one of these people had smoked salvia at some point in their life, which is what opened their slice to me being able to enter it. In salvia space, you have access to the infinite timelines of others who have smoked it. For a brief second, I could see into the slice where I came from. I saw myself sitting on the stoop in my garage, sitting there, with my head down and my eyes closed. Everything was distorted, though, as if I was viewing it through the window. I touched the slice and briefly became myself again. I opened my eyes and looked around, feeling incredible joy to be back here. I instantly felt my hands slip as the wheel sped back up, and I was torn back into salvia space and away from my body. I desperately clawed at the wheel, but it was moving too quickly. I would have to wait another eternity for the wheel to revolve again so that I could reach my slice. I debated trying to jump into another person's slice to get the hell out, but I didn't know if it would work, or, if it did, if I would effectively kill the person and take over their body. At that point, after experiencing so many other realities, I was having trouble remembering which one was mine. For those brief times, I fully believed myself to be the people in those moments. Who was I to say that the one I remember, of me on the porch in my garage, was really the reality I came from, or simply the one I touched last and remembered best? Fuck it, I thought. Anything is better than this. I waited until the wheel came around again and I could see my slice coming up. I clawed at the wheel again, once more experiencing the electric bone-drilling feeling until it slowed down. I grabbed my slice at the edges and thrust myself headfirst into it as hard as I could, desperately trying to get back to where I had been. As soon as my head made it through the slice, everything exploded. My skin was peeled off of me into countless dimensions, and my body was torn and twisted into shreds. I fell into blackness. Surrounding me were pieces of the slice I tried to climb into. Each one was a porthole, like on a submarine, into reality, but at different times of my life. There was no order. The windows were scattered around me. I could see a moment from when I was in middle school practicing the saxophone. I could see another of me sitting on a couch with my sister arguing about something stupid. I saw several more that I did not recognize, with people I didn't know. I assumed these were from my future, or from the future of whichever person I was being displayed, at least. I didn't even know if this was me anymore, or if this was just the slice I chose. I was afraid to touch these, as I didn't know if it would cause me to experience the moment as the slice had done earlier. I also worried it might toss me in at that point of time, further forward or back in time from where I had been. Then, I finally saw something that looked familiar. I was sitting in the garage, loading up the bowl, and R was talking to me. The perspective was weird, though. It seemed like I was looking up at myself from 30 feet away, as if I was deep in the concrete floor. I grabbed the window by the sides and again thrust myself forward as hard as I could. As soon as my feet made it through, I was back in my body. Well, in someone's body. I don't know if it was mine. At that point, I still had no memories. I was an empty shell in an unfamiliar body, in an unfamiliar place. Slowly, my recollection started to return to me. I remembered events from my childhood and my family. I remembered I was a college student. I came out to do something. What was it? I looked around and saw the bong at my feet, and suddenly it all came back to me. I smoked salvia, I cried out. That's what caused all of this. I looked behind me and discovered I could still see the tear in space where I had pulled myself through. I heard children, her children, laughing and chanting. I looked at the trees around me and could see them frantically working and creating everything around me. The trees stretched out and were trying to push me into the hole I came from. I instantly got up and ran to the other side of the garage, away from the trees and the rip I created. I turned around and looked through the door into the house. Everything was still distorted and spinning, and I could still hear the wheel's high-pitched shriek emanating from some unknown space. Slowly, the world became less choppy. I looked at the tear I had come through and saw millions of tiny children's hands reach through the other side, laughing hysterically the entire time, as if they found it hilarious that I had escaped. Did they know something I didn't? They pulled the rip closed and it slowly melted back together as they chanted, "See you soon, see you soon, see you soon." As soon as the hole closed, I could no longer hear the scream of the wheel. I heard the female's voice one last time, however. "Don't worry," it said. "You'll be back soon enough, my child. Enjoy your time." To this day, this is still one of the most traumatic experiences I have ever gone through. Immediately after I came down, I ran into the house and locked my bedroom door. Everything felt incredibly fake. I was shown how everything was made, how empty and pointless it all is. I had trouble talking to my roommates for a while because I saw them as philosophical zombies rather than as real people. From my newfound perspective, they were nothing but constructs. Empty shells pretending to be people. Perhaps they even were part of the wheel. After all, I was the only person in this world. Everything else was created by the wheel. The most significant issue I had after this was that for a while afterward, I was convinced that I wasn't back in the right body. I was certain that my present body had existed normally until its former occupant decided to smoke salvia, at which point one of the wheel's children, my consciousness, hopped in while he was absent. I only have the memories I do because they're stored in this body. If I had grabbed on to another slice, I wouldn't have been thrown into that body or shell instead, and I would have slowly remembered all of their memories. In short, I hijacked this body, and its prior resident is now trapped in that nightmarish realm. I know this sounds insane, and I realize that now, but it felt so incredibly real that I still have my doubts every now and then. Now, 8 years later, I feel comfortable enough to talk about this experience. I have PTSD-like nightmares once every few months where I find myself back in that hellish place. And I always wake up in a sweat and run across the room to get away before I realize where I am and that it was a dream. I bought more salvia off the internet, plain leaf and 5X, nothing stronger, in order to conquer my fear of the substance. Cue laughter. I now smoke plain leaf rarely and 5X even less often, and achieve an altered state of mind, but nothing of the magnitude I experienced on 20X. I am working up the courage to try and go back there so that I can see what really happened, but I know it will be a long time before I am comfortable enough to go that far. I've grown comfortable in this body the past few years, and I can't help but wonder what will happen if I can't make it back.
I saw my mate Ryan 3 weeks ago. For the first time in about 5 months. First time since I'd been thrown out of that gym, with the Wreck-Its closing in on me. I nearly didn't recognise him on the crowded tube platform, with his grey hoodie over his head and his big black bomber jacket that strained at the seams with the bulk of the man underneath. He looked terrible. His veins and arteries were so dark that they looked like they'd been drawn on. His eyes were crusted with that yellow powder. So was his nose, and the edges of his mouth. His ears seemed blocked with the stuff. More than that, though, his arms and chest were huge, and solid, inhumanly so. What? Ryan? I croaked. Ryan's head turned towards me. His neck creaked like an antique rocking chair. His dusty, yellowed eyes seemed glazed until they lit up with a brief flicker of recognition. His mouth tried to crack into a smile, but his lips moved with the stiffness of a ventriloquist's dummy. You could almost say it was the first time I'd ever seen Ryan, because before that night, Ryan had always been Wasp, a nickname he'd earned when we were both about 12, and he barged into me running away from a wasp's nest he'd accidentally disturbed when climbing on his auntie's roof. Wasp was a good mate. Mostly. He was shy, and positively awful with girls. Our first fight was just after I started dating my first girlfriend, Laura, and he revealed that he'd long harboured a thing for her. In his eyes, I was stealing her from him. Honestly, had I known in advance that he liked her, I would have backed off. But he was acting like he was entitled to her just because he silently decided he liked her first. And that pissed me off enough to date her anyway. Not my finest hour, I admit. He wasn't bad looking, but he had a face that needed a good growth spurt to make handsome. He needed puberty to hurry and square out his chin and line it with some designer stubble. But it never did. See, when I was about 14, I went from 5 feet tall to 6 feet 2 and bulked out accordingly. Wasp, however, seemed to top out around 5 foot 4. We used to rib him about it, and he used to laugh along. But I guess he took it more to heart than we thought, because pretty soon he started pumping weights. To be honest, for every good mate instinct I had to try and convince him that he was fine just the way he was, he did genuinely seem happier when bulked up. Within a few months, you'd never see him without a protein shake in his hand. He ate chicken fillets like some people chew gum, and he always carried an issue of Men's Health or Gym Fitness in his bag. Don't get me wrong, We still thought he looked like a knob poured into that tight t-shirt with a neckline plunging so low you could nearly see his belly button, and we all delighted in telling him as such as often as possible. But it gave him confidence, and I guess that's all that mattered. I mentioned our first fight was over a girl, but so was our worst fight. The summer I turned 15, I heard that Wasp's little sister Robin fancied me. I know, sisters are off limits, but I was young and stupid and hadn't really got a grasp of my hormones. The same genes that had missed Wasp had blessed his little sister with a petite figure and delicate features, all set off with deep blue eyes and dirty blonde hair. We got together at a party, and when Wasp found out, he was furious. He screamed at me, called me a bastard, and warned me to stay away from her. I'm not proud of what I said next. I know it was a low blow, but I was so angry that he told me off in front of everyone I just lost my temper. "Or what?" I yelled in his face. "What you gonna do, punch me in the shin?" Cue big laughs from everyone. I felt awful. I spent the next few weeks all but begging for forgiveness and promising to leave Robin alone. One day during a weight session, I guess he gave in. He squared up to me, flexing his growing arms, and he said, "If what you said the other day is true, all the worse for you, because if I can't punch you in the face, I'm going to deliver one hell of a smack to your bollocks." With that, a big grin spread across his face, and he punched me in the arm before going back to working out. It seemed like the problems were all done. But then he joined Meatz. See, when Wasp had got serious about bulking up, he started touring the local gyms. My family had a group membership to this fancy gym on an industrial site just off the motorway. It was huge, with an indoor pool, an outdoor pool, tennis court, spa, sauna, the works. It even had a bar, cafe type place that always seemed far fuller than any part of the actual gym. I brought Wasp there once and he hated it. He couldn't understand why anyone would pay that much to spend 20 minutes on the cross ski and then 2 hours reading the Sunday papers once a month. Needless to say, when he found the gym he liked, it was a scuzzy, sweaty, male-only 24-hour type place. All strip lights and free weights, and tattooed guys doing endless squats. Before Wasp got as heavily into it, we'd call the other guys there Wreckits, due to how much they looked like... well, I'm sure you can figure it out. It was a place called Meatz, because in the grand tradition of male-only gyms, they had to pick a name that could double for a gay bar. It was a small, converted warehouse surrounded by barbed chain-link fence. Car park was a mix of dirt and rubble with potholes that never seemed to fully dry out. The main shutter was permanently down, and the gym's logo had been crudely spray-painted over it, though it was now faded. The only usable entrance was a small side door covered in chip blue paint with a window that had wire crisscrossed through it. Security didn't appear to be a major concern for what was essentially a room full of men whose idea of a fun time involved picking up incredibly heavy things and then just sort of putting them down again. So Wasp started going to Meatz and carried on bulking up. But something changed when he started training there. After a few months, gone were the protein shakes and the chicken fillets and his macronutritional protein bars. Gone was the permanent bottle of water he carried around. I thought maybe he'd given up or reached his goal, but his bulking didn't seem to stop, or even slow. If anything, it sped up. He let his subscription to Men's Fitness expire and stopped drinking green tea, but his muscles didn't stop growing. Even girls started to notice. They used to look at him with flirty intrigue, but this was slowly turning into puzzled concern. The amount of bulk was concerning enough, but it was the speed at which he bulked up that was more worrying. Now, don't get me wrong. We're still young, but still, this was happening on a scale of weeks, if not days. I mean, I swear I could see stretch marks around his biceps where his skin just couldn't keep up. I asked him how he kept bulking without all his supplements, and he grinned. "The guys at Meatz sorted me out something new," was all he'd say. The breaking point came one day when Wasp fell down some stairs. It was nothing serious. He was too busy reading some news story about a suicidal man who jumped in front of a truck and just missed a step that sent him tumbling. He only fell a few feet, but the problem was how he landed. He put his hand out to break his fall, but his bag threw him off balance, and he landed on the outside of his palm, wrenching his elbow the wrong way. The sound was wrong. I'm pretty squeamish about these kind of things. I can't hear someone being sick without heaving myself. And that fraction of a second sound clip of that guy's teeth on the curb in American History X makes my balls hide somewhere in my large intestine. So my face was sucking a lemon at the anticipation of the sickening, squelching, dull crack I was about to hear when Wasp's arm broke. But that wasn't what I heard. It was sharper and louder and stiffer than I expected. It sounded like tree bark snapping, like a branch giving way when a kid tries to climb it. When I dared open my eyes, Wasp was just looking at his broken arm as it hung limply from its new bonus elbow. The break was bad enough, but the wound, it was bloodless. There was a good 2-inch tear in the skin that should have been gushing with blood, but it just hung open, flapping like torn wrapping paper. A fine, yellowish powder dripped out onto the floor. "I'll have to go," said Wasp, shoveling the spilt contents of his bag back inside. "No, wait," I called. "You have to go to the hospital." Then I saw it. I thought it was a pen at first, but no, it was a syringe. Clear as day. Of course it was. How had it taken this long to figure that out? There's only one way he could have kept up the gains without all his powders and shakes. He was on steroids. That's what those chav wreckits had sorted out for him. Seriously, Wasp, come on. I tried to follow him, but he ran. I called him all afternoon and into the evening, but no answer. Eventually I went round to his house, but Robin hadn't seen him. There was only one other place I could imagine he'd go. Meatz. I pounded on the chipped blue door. "Membership number." "Look, I'm not a member. I just need to know if Ryan is here." Membership number." The wreck-it behind the door mumbled again. "I'm not a member. Is Ryan here?" "Membership number." "Oh, hell, I don't know, 12? The door clicked open. As I said, security did not appear to be a major concern. I stormed past the wreck-it working what passed for a front desk. In reality, it was just a fold-out table, topped with a wood-effect plastic. On it sat a spreadsheet on a clipboard and a small blue strongbox. Quite the business empire. I carried on marching until I saw Wasp, bench pressing some obscene amount of weight. Another towering wreck-it behind him was a spotter. I stormed over, all ready to rip into him about steroids and abuse and getting his broken arm seen to. "Wasp, what are you doing? Your arm." "Stop calling me Wasp. My name's Ryan." "What? Since when don't you like being called Wasp?" "I know why you call me it. Just 'cause I'm small and annoying and pointless and I ruin everything, yeah?" "What? Of course not. That's not the reason. You damn well know it." "Of course it is. And now you're just mad I'm getting bigger than you." "Mate, when I met you, you were literally running away from wasps. How's it taken you this long to tell me you didn't like it?" "Yeah, whatever." It was this moment I realised all the other wreck-its had stopped working out and now had just sat on their equipment, watching our little domestic unfold. The room seemed bigger on the inside. The strip lights buzzed and beat down on the equipment, but the room's perimeter remained bathed in darkness. In those shadows, more of the wreckage swayed and watched. Look, Ryan, I'm sorry if you don't like the name. I won't use it anymore, I promise. I'm just worried about your arm. What about my arm? It's fine. Mate, I saw it snap. It was... By now, Ryan had sat up on his equipment and was leaning forward with his hands in his lap. His arm was fine, save for a particularly angry-looking stretch mark where the tear had been. Why isn't it... See, I'm fine. I'll prove it. With that, he lay back down under the equipment. Put some more weight on. His spotter turned around and started fixing some more weights to the bar. I went to stop him, but wordlessly, 3 of the Wreckets who'd been silently watching stood up and took a step towards me. The spotter finished putting the extra mass on. Ryan wrapped his fingers around the scored metal, and I heard a faint creaking, as though a tree was blowing in a gust. He took a deep breath and lifted the bar off the holder. He slowly lowered it down towards his chest and then, through gritted teeth, pushed the whole thing back up in locked arms. Repeat, repeat, repeat. It seemed to be getting easier with each rep. After 6 or so, he started talking. See, mate, this is why you're here. You can't stand that I'm becoming better than you. Repeat. No, Ryan, that's not it. Repeat. Yes, it is. I'm finally not small. Repeat. Or annoying. Repeat. Or pointless. Repeat. And you hate it. I heard a tearing sound, like the first cut into a new piece of card. The angry red stretch mark near his bicep had ripped open again. That same weird yellow powder was falling out. Some of the other Wreckets saw this too and took a step towards us. Ryan, please, you were never... Just leave. Go crying to my sister, you sodding b****. You don't want to see what comes next. Repeat. Ryan, stop. The tear widened. Leave. Repeat. Ryan, repeat. Go! The sound I heard next is imprinted on my mind forever. When I was 7, I spent the summer at my granddad's house, and he had this wide, fenceless front garden with a crabapple tree in the centre. I lost control of the football I'd been kicking about, and I followed it into the road without looking. There was a squeal of tyres and a blur of blue metal as a speeding car swerved onto the pavement and across my granddad's lawn straight into the tree. The sound was unforgettable, a deep, powerful splintering of wood. And Ryan's arm snapped too, just like the tree. Ryan's arm tore off at the bicep, and the weight came crashing down directly onto his chest. A tremendous cloud of light yellow powder pumped steadily out of his arm and engulfed him. I tried to rush forward and help, but 2 of the Wreckets grabbed me and dragged me backwards towards the door. I reached out, screaming for Ryan, but more Wreckets surrounded him, blocking him from view. The strip lights started shutting off. They threw me out of the door into a pothole full of oily water. I sprung up to get back in, but the door was already shut. The final lights inside went off. I stood there pounding on the door until it occurred to me to call the police. However, when they arrived and bust the door down, they found nothing. Just a bunch of Wreckets pumping iron. Police searched the place but found no trace of Ryan or the mysterious steroid they appeared to be using. 5 months passed. I didn't see or speak to Ryan once during that time. I was convinced he was terribly injured, or in hospital or worse. Imagine my surprise then when I ran into him one night on a crowded tube platform while awaiting the next northbound train. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Ryan, all right, and in one piece. Ryan, mate, what happened to you? What do you mean? I've never felt better. Where have you been? Everyone's looking for you. Everyone misses you. No, they don't. Not stupid little wasp. Not pointless, annoying wasp. Please, Ryan, I thought we got past this. No one thinks you're... Save it. I don't need your apologies. Not anymore. I've got a way to prove it. Prove what? Prove I'm not pointless. The northbound train's lights shone down the platform as it approached the station. For the love of... Ryan, no one ever said... He raised a brown, solid-looking hand and shushed me. Shh. As I said, I'll prove it. Ryan, please. But he only grinned widely again before turning towards the train and charging. And he jumped straight in front of him. I was back on my granddad's lawn again. That same sound. That same thick, powerful crack a speeding vehicle makes as it ploughs into a block of dense wood. In an instant, what had once been Ryan became a shower of splinters and yellow powder. I choked and gasped as the substance filled the air. Commuters standing nearby started screaming, then fell to their knees, coughing and heaving as they too tried desperately to shield themselves from the debris. It was no use. I cradled my head in my hands and felt a shower of powder fall from my hair. I scrubbed furiously in my efforts to dislodge it, and ended up with lungs full of whatever it was. It clung to my tongue with a sour sting. That was 3 weeks ago. Since the day Ryan leapt to his death, others have followed suit, always jumping into the path of moving trains, always on crowded platforms, always followed by the same shower of mysterious yellow dust. Despite the alarming increase in suicides, there's been no official explanation as to why this is happening. Every day there are reports of more jumpers, in more cities. Meanwhile, I've noticed the local membership of Meatz has tripled, and it keeps growing. And I don't even lift. But everyone keeps complimenting me, telling me how ripped I'm getting.
Her family had lived in that house on that street for as long as Ahnika could remember. She had her birthday parties in that backyard and swung from the big tree in the front yard until the rope wore down and the metal creaked. Every Christmas morning, her and her brothers gathered on the floor before the tree, and every Easter they sat on the back porch and dyed eggs to fill with confetti and glitter. Their walls were covered in both old and new photos. Some black and white, some faded sepia, and others from the weekend previous. It had always seemed to smell of her grandmother's flowery perfume and smoke from their small wood-burning fireplace. Not too big, but big enough, as her father always said. It was home, serving as the backdrop for every fond memory she held dear. Well, them and a less pleasant one. Having lived in that neighborhood for so long, they had come to be close with almost all of their immediate neighbors. To their left lived an elderly couple Ivana knew simply as Mr. and Mrs. Herrera, who always sat in rocking chairs in their netted enclosed porch. And to their right lived the Campbell family. The Campbell's house was painted a lilac color, and their yards were separated by nothing more than a chain-link fence. It had a bigger front yard, too, or at least it felt that way since they lacked bushes or trees, which in turn led to many afternoons spent playing tag there with the Campbell kids. The youngest of them was a girl 2 years older than Ivana named Alyssa. The two were very close, and often walked to school with their arms linked as they tried to stomp in every puddle or kick as much snow off the sidewalk as they could. Alyssa was at every one of those birthday parties without fail, and Ivana climbed over the fence to join every one of hers. They agreed that nothing could ever separate them, and someday they might even move away together. The best thing was, in their minds, the fact that their bedroom windows were both on the sides of their respective houses, facing each other. The two of them would sit on the windowsills, perched like birds, and spent many hours talking by writing on notebooks and holding them up for each other to see. They would get each other's attention late at night with a few flickers of a flashlight, and reveled in the disobedience and perceived danger of it all should they be found awake. Gossip, homework answers, anything to preoccupy each other until they were too tired to stay awake. Ivana looked forward to it every night, especially on days when chores and schoolwork kept her out of the yard. Snowy and sick days were by far the worst, and she sought comfort in leaning against the glass with her flashlight in hand. Alyssa was her best friend, and she loved her. Alyssa, unfortunately, didn't stick around as long as she had planned. That warm summer morning when the moving truck pulled up in front of the lilac house, the two girls were heartbroken. Neither of them had known that far in advance, and when the news had been broken to them, it was taken with the hopeless sort of sadness that came with the inevitable. It rained that afternoon, and Alyssa stood in her window with her backpack over one shoulder, waving goodbye. She wasn't crying, and Ivana smiled back with as much reassurance as she could muster. After her friend had gotten into the car and drove away with all her family's belongings in tow, however, all she could do was cry into her pillow so nobody would hear. She was a big girl after all. "No, Mommy, it's okay. We're gonna call and write letters. She'll do it. She promised." The house was empty for a long while, growing weeds while remaining vacant and silent. They stayed out of the front yard and only went over to pick the for sale sign back up when it would fall over. Winter blanketed the house in snow that was left untarnished by footsteps until spring. The lawn turned brown under the summer sun without someone to water it in the evenings. School started back up again, and Ivana had only received one letter and 2 phone calls from her old friend. They didn't know what to talk about either time. She wouldn't have noticed the for sale sign go down if it wasn't for her brother Thomas's suspicious tendencies. Thomas had said multiple times that he had seen people going in and out, but their parents insisted that they had been keeping an eye out and had seen nothing. When he pointed the now empty yard out to their father, he shrugged and suggested that maybe someone was moving in. They never saw a moving truck or the big spectacle that accompanied new tenants. The red pickup truck was just there one day. At first it appeared that only one person had moved in. A man with a thick white mustache and thinning silver blonde hair would occasionally leave to go and buy groceries, and sometimes he would just pace the porch in the evenings with a beer can in one hand, wearing nothing but a wife-beater and a pair of grimy jeans. He introduced himself reluctantly in passing once as Douglas. Ivana didn't like the way his gaze lingered on her when he noticed her standing there. Sometimes she would go out and swing, only to go inside promptly after noticing him in the window or looking out the screen door. He looked like he couldn't figure out what she was, like she was some unidentifiable animal prowling about the property. One late winter night, something else happened that she found unsettlingly odd. She lay in bed, half awake, when something in the window of Alyssa's old room caught her attention. It was a tiny flicker, not like a flashlight, but more the reflection of light off something else. She sat up, convinced it was a trick of memory and light. The flickering was deliberate, a pattern of varying durations, and something was moving ever so slightly between the half-drawn curtains in the darkness of the supposedly vacant room. Sliding out from under the covers, she made her way to the window and cupped her hands around her eyes for a clearer look. The room wasn't vacant at all. A girl a few years younger than her stood almost out of sight with a compact mirror in hand. She was using the glow of the street lamp and waved excitedly when she was noticed. She moved forward and began to mouth something unintelligible as Ivana reached for her notebook in response. "Hey there, who are you?" The girl looked confused and didn't appear to understand either what was written or what the question was. She stared blankly at her for a moment before she mouthed a simple question. "Name?" Ivana nodded, urging her to answer. She pointed to herself and mouthed Ivana as well as she could before pointing to the girl for her response. "Marissa." After a few tries, Ivana turned back to the notebook and held it up long enough for the girl to decipher. "It's nice to meet you, Marissa." Marissa nodded happily and smiled a wide, toothy grin. She was missing a few front teeth, but didn't seem to mind. Soon they would be back, seeing that adult teeth were beginning to peek out of her gums. It was nothing unusual for a child her age. She pointed out and then held up 2 fingers. The message was clear. You too. Before she could write anything more, Marissa's head turned and she suddenly looked flustered. She turned back only to wave before slipping back out of sight. This left Ivana slightly rattled, wondering if this was something normal or not. Some people were just shy, she knew, and she didn't want to make mountains out of molehills, but the encounter left her uncomfortable. It wasn't the last time Marissa appeared in the window. She would stand there waiting for her new friend to notice and come to the window. She only appeared at night at first, which allowed the "I'm tired, gotta sleep" half excuse to be used. Only the sad look on Marissa's face made her insides writhe with guilt. It was difficult to talk since she never had any paper and wouldn't open the window because there was a house alarm installed. So the conversations were quite brief. The girl's voice was a mystery for the longest time. Soon she was there during the day too, which made things less unsettling and more uncomfortable. The window would slide open at around 9 in the morning, and if she was anywhere in sight, Marissa would call her name. Sometimes she threw little pebbles at the glass until she came to look. She spoke too fast and asked too many questions, which Ivana politely answered until an excuse popped up. It made her feel like a horrible sort of friend. "Do you have a dog? My dad's allergic to pet fur or something. What are you doing? Homework? Oh yeah, spelling is hard. Really, really hard. What took you so long to get home? Do you walk or ride a bus? I like the bus. Do you want to play something? I have lots of dolls. Do you want to come over and play? I have lots of games we could play." For someone with so many questions, however, there was one that she refused to answer herself, which made Ivana even more suspicious. One afternoon, while unpacking the necessary supplies to complete her homework, Marissa asked her what she did at school and continued to pry at details. Swallowing hard to push back at the apprehensiveness, she turned and asked, "Where do you go to school, Marissa? I never see you at mine." The girl in the window looked as if she were suddenly put on a stage with a spotlight in her face. "I used to go to private school by my mom's house, but Daddy's been homeschooling me or something." "Really? Is it fun staying at home?" "Sure, I guess." She tilted her head as if listening, then her eyes widened in surprise. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. My daddy's calling. See you later." That evening at dinner, she brought up Marissa to her parents. She told them everything about her, all the questions and the weird feelings she got. She admitted how she had been actively avoiding her and sneaking around so she wouldn't see her. At first her parents didn't seem to worry, saying that their new neighbor was just a little nosy. Thomas seemed more interested, and she could tell by his face that he was more curious than anything else. After dinner he asked if he could see Marissa, and there wasn't any logical reason she should answer no. But when they tried to get her attention, they found that night she didn't come to the window. Thomas made sure the window was locked before going back into his own room. A week passed, and they waited for the strange neighbor friend. A week passed, and Marissa was nowhere in sight, and neither of them had any desire to go knocking on the door with Douglas inside. Maybe she's imaginary. I'm too big for imaginary friends. Finally, on a particularly cold evening, she saw the flicker from the window once again. The window was indeed open, but only enough for Marissa to whisper through. She looked all right, albeit a little tired. "Hey, Ivana, you want to see something cool?" "What is it?" "I made a pillow fort. It's really fun, and it's got multiple little rooms. If you're sneaky, you could come over and we can play in it." "Why do I have to be sneaky?" "Daddy doesn't like people coming over. They make messes. You won't, but he thinks you will." "Where's this pillow fort?" "It's in the crawl space under the living room floor. You wanna?" Ivana swallowed hard. "It's late, and I have school tomorrow. I gotta go to bed soon, I'm sorry." "It's okay. I just never have any friends over. It's like they forgot about me." "Oh, I bet they didn't. Everyone's in school, and I'll ask my mom tomorrow." Marissa cracked a little smile, and for a while they sat in silence. "Is Douglas your dad?" Ivana asked slowly, as if she were tiptoeing around. The little girl in the window made a face she hadn't before. Her brow furrowed and she shook her head. "Douglas?" "Yeah. He and my dad only talked a little. He doesn't seem to like neighbors much." "That's not my daddy's name." Thomas wouldn't let such new information go, and spent more time trying to encounter Marissa himself. He asked questions like, "Does she look like him?" or "What else did she say about him?" Still, there was no response whenever Thomas was present, even if he hid so she couldn't see him. This frustrated him greatly, and he continued to bring it up to their parents only to be told not to spy on the neighbors. At one point, he accused his sister of making it all up because she was upset about Alyssa. On a chilly November morning, Ivana proved she wasn't making anything up. It was about 4:30 before the sun had begun to rise up into the gray winter sky. The entire family was woken by the sound of glass shattering. She was the first to get up and figure out what had caused the noise, since all she had to do was peek out the window. The window Marissa had so frequently perched in had shattered outward, scattering shimmering shards of glass all over the weeds in the window well below. There the dark-haired girl stood, her curly locks no longer in their neat braids, and her eyes wide with fear, or at least what she perceived to be fear. She was shaking her head, and when Ivana called her name, she looked around frantically, her eyes unfocused. I can't see, it's too dark, I don't want to be here, please. Marissa, I'm right here, what happened? She waved her arms, but the girl only groped around blindly. I don't want to go into the dark place. It's not fun. It's not fun! There was another indistinct thud, and then her voice was gone. Everyone rushed in shortly after, but nobody could figure out what had happened, or what she was even talking about when she tried to articulate what she had seen. That afternoon, Ivana decided to call Alyssa, in hopes of telling someone who would better understand. She sat in her windowsill, looking out as she listened to the ringing in anticipation. Alyssa's mother answered after 3 attempts, sounding irritated before giving over the phone. Hey, Ivana, how are you? Something weird is happening at your house. She went into detail, explaining what was happening, from the first night to that morning, and her old friend only listened in a nervous silence. It was only after Ivana mentioned Marissa's offer to join her in the crawlspace pillow fort that Alyssa spoke up. Wait, she said she was playing in the crawlspace? Mm-hmm. She wanted me to go and see it. It was under the living room floor. You've been to my house, though. We have a basement just like yours, no crawlspace. Really? Oh, yeah. It was then, while absent-mindedly staring at the window, she noticed Douglas practically running from his house, hastily tossing ratty suitcases and bags into the back of his red truck. He was staring all around, as if afraid someone would sneak up on him, then jumped in and drove away. She went hopping down the stairs, eager to tell Thomas, only to find her father sitting on the couch, leaning forward to focus all attention on the news report. Hey, honey, isn't that... Her mother came running in, and they all stared in horror as the breaking news ribbon moved across the screen, and a photo of a man with a thick white mustache and silver blonde hair was put on screen. The local reporter spoke with grim urgency. Police are searching for 55-year-old Douglas Hume, who is the primary suspect in the murder of Sandra and Anthony Mitchell, as well as the abduction of their 7-year-old daughter. After neighbors reported a foul smell coming from the attached duplex where Hume had previously lived, police found the Mitchells' remains buried in the crawlspace, after having been missing for nearly 4 months. Police believe that Hume is tied to multiple robberies and abductions all over the state. He is considered to be armed and very dangerous. If you have any information concerning the whereabouts of Mr. Hume, please contact the number on this screen. Ivana watched in shock as her mother snatched the phone from her hands and darted to the kitchen to dial the number.
Peter lay still in the early morning hours, feeling the press of the coming 365 days and the chill of winter nipping around the edges of his covers. He remembered the advice one of Shelby's friends had given him when he first arrived in California. 2 years, a gregarious fellow named Gabriel had said, as they sat on lawn chairs sipping away on Tecate and other beers Peter had never encountered before. Streamers hung overhead, and a decimated piñata dangled from the basketball hoop, battered from the assaults by Gabriel's children. Stretched out above it all was a store-bought banner that proclaimed, "Welcome back, Shell." Handwritten in black marker was the tag, "And welcome, Pete." Peter felt that it was a nice addition. "Yeah, 2 years for what?" he asked. "To assimilate," Gabriel said, though in his current state speaking through equal parts tequila and Negro Madeo, the word snuck past his lips sounding more like simulate. "You know, to feel like SoCal is, you know, home." Peter still hadn't fallen into the rhythms of the place. He felt a little odd wearing shorts in October, and his New England accent still proved to be a source of amusement for far too many people. The cashier at the supermarket up the street had actually asked him to repeat words in his native dialect, "Ka" and "yad," before she would hand him his change. Peter suspected he would never quite simulate, but there was nowhere else he'd consider home. Where Shelby was, wherever that might be, would always be where he belonged. Their first date back in D.C. had lasted 8 hours, covering everything from her childhood in Northern California to her research at the university, and, most importantly, her very definite plans for what to do in case of a zombie apocalypse. In the weeks that followed that first date, Peter discovered that life was divided neatly into 2 periods of time. The time with Shelby, and the time away from her. Within a month they were living together, and when she announced a job opportunity had come up in California, Peter didn't debate relocating for even a moment. Less than a week later, he'd successfully gotten his request for a transfer to the California branch of Bellator Corp, approved with a speed unheard of in the firm's history. Now, sitting in bed, Peter looked out their window on Wrigley Lane. Ordinarily, the sky above his home was a uniform, featureless pale blue. But after half a decade of drought, El Niño had come back and brought the first honest rain that Peter had known in this place. For a week, there were actual clouds above. They had been dark and full, too. Today, however, they held back at a respectable distance above the town. It was, after all, parade day. Peter watched Henry, their son, lying still on the tiny screen of his baby monitor. In the distance, he could barely hear the preparations for the festivities. Nothing definite, just the wind carrying the occasional bang of a drum or snippet of a voice, broadcast over loudspeakers. He picked up the TV remote. The NBC affiliate was covering the parade. The perennial hosts sat in a booth above the route, their practiced smiles plastered tightly to their faces. Peter watched as the first float came into the camera's view. Posies, river reeds, and other arranged vegetation illustrated a collection of fanciful scenes that flowed from jungle to peaked castle. The float's riders moved from scene to scene by way of slides placed between them. They cavorted with all manner of bizarre, multi-limbed creatures as fanciful aircraft and spaceships bounced overhead. The tradition of the parade had begun years ago, when people like him, transplants from the frigid East, decided to celebrate the warm paradise they now inhabited. It had been held every New Year's Day since 1890, save for those that fell on a Sunday. Locals said that the founders had made a nodding agreement with the Almighty when the floats rolled out on that first day. They vowed to never hold it on a Sunday, and, for his part, God would never let it rain on the procession. Looking at the horizon and the line of rolling black clouds held at bay, Peter could almost believe it. He heard the bedroom door open and his wife appeared a moment later.
"How's Henry?"
she inquired. Peter held the baby monitor in his hand up to her and, as if on cue, their son let out a comically loud snore. Shelby's face broke into a grin above her puffy eyes.
"He's so cute,"
she said adoringly.
"Did you make tea?"
"Not yet," Peter replied. Shelby gave him a jokingly disapproving look.
"Oh, you know the rules, Mr. Sandow. You wake up first, you make the tea. At least, get the water started."
"And I'm sorry, Dr. Sandow, I don't know what I could have been thinking."
Useless.
She smiled and shuffled towards the kitchen to fulfill the task in question. "Happy New Year," Peter called after her. Her head and shoulders appeared at the door.
Shh.
She pressed her index finger to her lips and then withdrew her hand to point at Henry's door.
"Happy New Year, honey,"
she replied with a smile. A small wail came from both the screen and Henry's room, announcing that their little boy was ready to join the rest of the world. "I got him," Peter said as he got up from the couch.
Yeah, you do.
Shelby called from the kitchen, silence no longer a concern. They got Henry changed, fed, and dressed. His tendency to sling formula around made it madness to try it in any other order. Shelby made waffles while Peter prepared mimosas for them to sip and marinated steaks that would later be placed on the grill. Periodically, they would check in on the parade's progress, marching bands and well-groomed horses weaving their way down Colorado Boulevard between the floats. They had yet to go see the parade in person, at least not the one during the day. Anybody wanting a reasonably good live view either had to be part of the media coverage or sleep out on the sidewalk the night before. After the parade was over, though, the floats would park at a local high school parking lot. Folks would be charged admission for the chance to walk around and view all the care and craft that went into putting these wonders together. Peter and Shelby had discussed taking Henry to see them when he was old enough to remember it, but that was still years away. After everyone got an eyeful of the blossom-strewn works of art, they'd be gathered up into a convoy. The greenery would be tied down with a skeleton crew doing various tasks to keep the floats together as they drove several miles to the stadium. There, they'd be taken apart, stripped of their finery, and rendered nothing more than bare wire frames. It was what Shelby called the nighttime show. The year they'd first arrived on Wrigley, they celebrated the new year much as they did this year. They cooked and watched the parade, doing a fair bit of day drinking while they observed. The days of carousing and imbibing like it was an occupation had passed them by. Peter suspected, now that Harry was with them, that there was a very good chance they'd soon stop staying up until midnight as well. The prior evening's festivities consisted of him watching a rerun of Family Guy, while Shelby slept on the couch beside him. When he roused her to tell her it was midnight and marked the moment with a kiss, she muttered something and trundled off to bed without another clear word passing her lips. The year before had been so different. That evening a year ago, Shelby had stuck her head up against their great bay window and slightly wide-eyed gestured for Peter to follow her outside. Most of the neighbors were already gathered outside, watching the floats pass by, slowly chugging along down the main road toward the stadium. Standing there, the two of them watched the gray shapes approach, their remaining glory revealed in the wavering pools cast by the streetlights overhead. It was a stripped-down, spontaneous encore of a performance, a great, secret show that only the locals knew about. Standing there in the chill of that evening, Peter occasionally looked at his neighbors, people that strangely did not generally interact with one another. But that night, each time he caught someone's eye, the two would smile at each other and nod in a companionable way. No one spoke, no one hollered. There was a kind of reverence to this. Dozens of floats passed by. Occasionally, the riders, those maintaining these temporary vehicles for the last few miles, would look up from their labors and wave. The group watched until the last in the convoy, a bizarre little scene depicting various prehistoric creatures crawling out of the La Brea pits, faded into the darkness. Shelby stood in front of him, allowing Peter to wrap his arms around her. Together, they silently bid goodnight to their neighbors as all retreated into their homes. That night, as they settled into bed, Peter felt sleepy, heavy in that delightful way sometimes felt before a wonderful night's rest. The day had been peaceful, the night almost magical. He slid over to his wife and buried his head in her hair, breathing deeply as he drifted off into sleep. After a time, he found himself, without explanation, no longer in his bedroom, or the formless nothing of sleep, but instead at the corner of Colorado Boulevard. Above him, the sky was clear and cloudless. He soon became aware that he was not alone on the street. Cardboard people of every age and hue had formed rough lines on both sides of the boulevard. They all wore the same vacant, rigid smile secured to their faces, and Peter could smell that they reeked of rotting flowers. As one, they turned their heads, their eyes wide with some indiscernible emotion. For a terrible moment, Peter was certain that they were staring at him. But following their gaze, his eyes fell on something on the distant horizon. A speck along the curve of the earth, tiny as a drop of blood trickling its way down a pricked finger. He stood with the gathered crowd, unable to look away from that far-off thing. Soon he could feel its approach reverberating in his chest. He began to make the object out, identifying distinct individuals that comprised a column of people. He watched as each one, in perfect time with one another, would raise one leg and bring it down with a brutal crack against the asphalt, only to repeat the motion with the other leg a moment later. With each strike, Peter could make out more details. They wore uniforms, drab gray with brass ornaments flashing from the chest and shoulders. They made Peter think of military cadets or a marching band. He soon saw that all of the figures carried an instrument of some kind, either in front of them or hoisted on their shoulders. Then he could hear the music they made, or at least it was something like music. Cymbals crashed and drums banged out at odd arrhythmic intervals. Horns of every description blared shrill notes in horrendous counterpoint to the synchronicity of the band's marching feet. Every few feet, one of the marchers would tear free from the crowd and post along the route, blocking the mass of humanity that had gathered to watch from coming any closer. Each onlooker wore the same static idiot leer as those standing around Peter, but all of their eyes burned with an unnatural intensity that spoke only of simple hatred. After hundreds, maybe even thousands of them passed by Peter, he saw a single float making progress down the street. A simple flat bed with wire frames rising from it, covered only in patches of wilted or rotting flowers. A small collection of people milled around those patches. Some were elderly, others looked to be in the prime of their lives. Some held children in their arms. No one looked particularly happy or sad. Their eyes simply moved languidly from one side of the route to the next, showing no particular interest. They did not speak to each other. They didn't even seem aware of each other. Well, except for the two that rode at the front of the float. One was a young woman dressed as though she'd just come from the gym, likely a senior in high school or a college freshman. There was something wrong with her, though. Her posture looked stooped, broken somehow. Her face was strained with the tremendous effort it must have taken for her to simply stand. Each jostle of the decaying platform brought a fresh expression of agony to her young face. Her hand rested on the shoulder of an elderly man seated in an old wooden chair. The touch seemed as much out of a need for support as any sign of affection it might have meant. The elderly gentleman vacantly scanned the crowd as he waved to them, but received no recognition except their ever-present toothy grins. From the man's position, Peter immediately guessed him to be the Grand Marshal of this procession. Periodically, the elderly man's eyes would roll to the back of his head. He wore an ornate crown that pulled with such a weight on him that his neck lolled to the side. Peter wasn't entirely sure, but it almost looked like it was made of thorns. The young woman tapped the marshal on his shoulder and pointed downward as they passed Peter. He watched the old man allow gravity to snap his head toward him, and over the cacophony, Peter heard a voice as old as time say one word. Hello. And then he was awake. Peter sputtered around for a few moments as the dream slowly bled away from him. He calmed down and began taking in the world around him. In his own bedroom, he became aware of the complete, blurred stillness of his surroundings. There was a small, hitching noise that he couldn't first identify, as if it was coming to him through cotton. His surroundings refused to come into clear view. As he began blinking his eyes furiously, he found that they were filled with salty tears. Had he woken up crying? Shelby bolted up and over his stuttering breath asked Peter what was wrong. He had no words to describe it, except that he'd had a nightmare. She cradled him and slowly ran her fingers over his brow until he drifted back to sleep. When he awoke again, he'd largely forgotten about the disturbing interlude. There were bills to pay, birthdays to remember. Days turned into months, and in February of that year, Shelby announced that their family was to grow by one. With the press of everyday life and impending fatherhood, there was no time to dwell on a single night of poor rest. That is until one night, while watching the news, Peter rubbing Shelby's shoulders, they came across the story of Cynthia Ann Ryder. The story itself was not remarkable. Most people will hear a version of it at least once a year or more. A local teenager on her way back from a party tries to run the spotlight, just enough alcohol buzzing through her system to never see the truck that had the green. According to the report, she told her parents she was meeting up with some friends after soccer practice. Miss Ryder's body was thrown from the vehicle. She expired at the scene. Both Shelby and Peter remarked on the event with the offhanded and directionless sympathy most have upon hearing such a story. The next day, however, while sitting at his desk, Peter thought about the girl and felt a sharp and suddenly pressing need, to put a face to the name Cynthia Ann Ryder. Peter searched for her name and came across a few LinkedIn and Facebook profile results. People looking for new employment opportunities, and one young lady in Ohio that had won a county spelling bee the previous April. After a bit of sifting, he came across the Cynthia Ann he was looking for on one of the local news station's websites. He scanned the details about her from the article. Good student, taught soccer at a summer camp for underprivileged youth, a wonderful big sister to her 9-year-old brother. None of these or any of the other assorted details about her life set off any bells for Peter. But when he saw her photo, a tickle pressed at the back of his mind. Something oddly familiar about the slope of her nose, the shape of her eyes. Where do I know her from? Peter wondered about the girl for the rest of the day. At meetings and in casual conversation, it gnawed at his every moment until he laid his head down that night. When his head touched the pillow, he smelled Shelby's shampoo and, for the first time since that day so early in the year, he remembered the parade. He put Cynthia's face to the shattered form of the girl riding the float in that nightmare landscape, and he recalled the old man, the Grand Marshal. He wanted to jolt upright, to do something about the whole ordeal. What was that going to be? He had no idea. But it was already too late. He felt himself slipping into sleep as though he were sliding irreversibly down a long tunnel. When he emerged on the other side, he was along the parade route again, and the float was drawing close. There was no sign of the young woman in her gym gear who would never see her first semester of college. Cynthia Ann Ryder had shuffled off this life. The parade had moved her along. Peter saw the others still riding with the marshal, their eyes drowsily scraping the crowd as they passed. There was someone else standing by the marshal now, a dark-skinned man with a severe militaristic manner. His face was smoothly shaven and placid, his eyes full of shrewd wariness, looking out at the crowd with the same intensity he'd leveled during staff meetings back in D.C. Peter could place that detail because, unlike Cynthia Ryder many nights before, he recognized this man. He had worked with him for the better part of 5 years, and while they hadn't been friends, they'd certainly liked each other enough to engage in polite conversation. Peter would ask about the man's family, and Clarence Wise would ask how Pete's gal was getting along. He looked just as Peter remembered him. That is until he turned his head. That simple motion gave Peter full view of his former co-worker's face, and the ghastly wounds that had destroyed most of it. The lower part of Wise's jaw had been pulped by some terrific force. Whatever it was had traveled up past his left eye and exploded out the top of his head, turning his cranium into some kind of gory, improvised funnel. This grotesque parody of his old friend stared at Peter, recognition lighting in his sole remaining eye. Peter saw Wise's mouth attempt to form some kind of word as he bent toward the marshal's ear. "Hello," said the Grand Marshal. Somewhere within the infinite weariness of that voice, there was also a hint of familiarity. Peter was an old friend come to visit, someone that the Marshal expected to see again. Upon waking and taking the time to gather himself, Peter started making calls back to every number he still had in his phone from the D.C. office. But, it being a Saturday, there was no answers until he tried Kenny Bryden's number.
"Hello, Bellator Corp. This is Kenny Bryden. How may I help you?"
Kenny's Jersey accent clanged across the line. "Hey, Kenny, it's Peter Sandow." It had been 2 years, and though he'd been in the cubicle opposite Kenny for a long time, he had no expectations of being remembered.
"Petey!"
the boisterous voice proclaimed. Despite his 57 years, Kenny was full of bounding, aggressive optimism that could be both just what you needed to hear in the middle of the week and the most grating thing on a Monday morning.
"Is it you blowing up every phone in the office? You forget what day it is?"
No, I was hoping to catch anyone, really. I'm trying to get a hold of Clarence Wise. Had a question I thought he could answer. Kenny sighed deeply.
It's not likely.
Peter felt cold.
Rumor is, yesterday, Clarence got up early and made breakfast for his kids. He told his wife he was headed out to the garage get something out of his car, or something like that. After an hour or so, she went looking for him.
He could already picture Clarence walking down the perfectly shoveled path from his house, his head hung low, moving with the same purposeful stride he always had.
She found him in the note he'd written, apologizing for the mess.
Kenny shuffled the papers on his desk loudly enough for Peter to hear them in California. What, did it say why? Peter did not want to ask how. He was certain he already knew.
Don't know, but I doubt it. He wasn't the type to complain.
An edge of admiration was present in Kenny's voice. Peter struggled through a few more minutes of question and answer with Kenny, but in the end none of it lodged too deeply in his memory. Clarence Wise was dead, by his own hand, and he had known in advance. It would follow that pattern again and again. A relative he hadn't seen in years had died of a heart attack while jogging. A drunk had killed a neighbor's child because they just refused to take a cab home. On the evening news, a family of 4 died in an avalanche in Colorado. Peter saw every last one in turn take his or her place alongside the Grand Marshal. There was never enough time to do anything about it, though. No appointed time was ever given, no address, no set of instructions that led him to being at the right place at the right time. He was simply the nightly witness to the parade and its passengers. There were times in the early morning hours, tears burning his eyes for the umpteenth time, that he considered joining Clarence. But there were still bills to pay. He had a job with the increasing responsibilities that came with climbing the corporate ladder, and he was trying to balance all of it with a new child in the house, trying to find any gaps in the baby-proofing measures he and Shelby had taken. So his nights, filled with unease and terror, slowly became just another fact of his life. Somehow he managed the day-to-day miracle of not simply cracking from the strain. At the start of October, his branch manager, Mr. Rivers, called him to the 4th floor, home to senior management, to discuss a project that he'd been working on for the company. The lower floors were all open concept space, cubicles with dividers so low that you could see all your coworkers at once, facilitating collaboration, said the administration. When the elevator doors slid open, Peter noted that the managers had more traditional offices, granting them such luxuries as walls and doors. Peter knocked upon arriving at Rivers' door. Mr. Rivers invited him in as he sat comfortable behind his overly large and imposing desk. He was a neatly attired man of some indeterminate middle age, wearing a double-breasted suit that was a few years out of style. His double chin and earnest attempt at a comb-over did not detract from his air of authority. Another man with a full head of stark white hair sat in front of Rivers but made no move to turn around as Peter approached.
Ah, Peter. Please, have a seat.
Rivers rose slightly and gestured at the chair next to the white-haired man.
Do you know Tom Bedford?
Peter had heard the name and had seen pictures on the company's website. Mr. Bedford, the director of West Coast Development. Mr. Bedford presenting to the shareholders. Mr. Bedford meeting with regulatory officials in D.C. Mr. Bedford biking down the 101 on a charity ride he organized every year. Sponsored by Bellator, of course.
I don't believe we've met before.
The man in his casual polo shirt exuded a virility that Peter never believed he could achieve in his own lifetime. Bedford stood and, smiling, offered Peter his hand.
Hello,
Tom Bedford, and I've been hearing some great things. The rest of his greeting was difficult to hear as the blood pounded in Peter's ears. Hello. 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 The word he'd said to Peter almost every night that year. Every night as he wore that awful crown on his head, his grimacing face turned towards the sky, his eyes flashing white as if in mid-seizure. Hello. Standing before Peter in Mr. Rivers' office was Tom Bedford, head of West Coast Development for Bellator Corp. Standing before Peter in Mr. Rivers' office was the Grand Marshal of the parade. The meeting carried on for a while. Peter responded to their questions, offered projections for completion. At the end of their time, seeming pleased with the results, Bedford excused himself as he had to run to another appointment. He thanked Peter for his time. As an afterthought, he told Peter that he was certain they'd meet again. Peter successfully fought back the urge to shriek in the man's face. It was Friday, after all, and near enough 5 o'clock to go home. He stayed up late that night, desperate to avoid sleep. But after a number of beers meant to fight the rising panic, his eyelids announced their resignation to their fate and slid over his eyes as he sat on the couch. He was once again on the corner of Colorado Boulevard on a clear and cloudless day. The crowd gathered, the band struck up the music, and the parade's column moved down its appointed path. At last the float, the one he'd seen so many times, drew near, and Peter saw that Tom Bedford alone rode atop it. Without the weight of the others to balance it, the float bucked and rattled like a rickshaw, only emphasizing the horrible gesticulations of Bedford's form. It groaned to a halt in front of Peter. The music stopped. The marchers were gone. The murmur of the crowd had ceased. Peter looked around him and was alone with the marshal on the route. Peter, in absolute certainty, had only one thought. It's me now. It's my turn. He thought about Shelby finding his corpse on the couch in the morning. He thought about her raising Henry alone. He wept, and he kept weeping until he heard the marshal's voice croak out a single word. Goodbye. And with that, Peter was awake on his couch, feeling the edge of a nasty hangover approaching. Upon opening his work computer the following Monday, he saw a new email in his inbox with the subject line, "A loss in the Bellator family. It is with sadness that we must inform you that last Sunday Tom Bedford suffered a dreadful crash on his bicycle. Though all efforts were made, his injuries were too severe for him to recover." The rumor around the office was that it had first seemed an insignificant accident. Another rider had drifted too close to Bedford, and in his attempts to avoid the crash, he had fallen headfirst off the trail into some brambles. The jovial man had laughed off the scratches from the thorns, simply taking some aspirin to combat the ache in his head. After arriving home, he'd drawn up a chair at his kitchen table and told his wife that whatever she was cooking for dinner smelled great. Mrs. Bedford was confused, as it was 10 o'clock and nothing was in the oven. A moment later, Tom Bedford, a man in phenomenal shape for his mid-50s, fell off the chair and began writhing on his kitchen floor. In the weeks and months that followed, Peter did not dream, not of the parade, not of anything at all. He was grateful for the simplicity of shutting his eyes and finding nothing waiting to greet him. The whole thing receded and seemed more of a fevered notion he once had than a memory of real events. Halloween came and went. Thanksgiving followed. Then Christmas. And before he knew it, New Year's Day was almost upon them. Now, as they sat and watched and clapped along with Henry at everything that tickled his fancy, Peter felt happier than he had in a long time. They watched everything together, from the riders on their majestic horses to the marching bands to the floats themselves. At one point, Shelby leaned over to her husband when Henry seemed so excited that he might burst at any minute. She whispered that she couldn't wait to see what Henry thought of the nighttime show. As the evening came, they gathered with their neighbors as they had the year before, and watched as the wondrous fabrications were transported past their street and out into the night. Peter stood next to Shelby with Henry in his arms, listening to every delighted "ooh" that came out of his son, and, for the first time since his last dream, wondered if he might see the parade one more time that night. That night, with Henry tucked safely in his crib, Peter lay next to Shelby with his eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling above him. Again, he did not want to sleep, fearing that this period had been a lull, the eye of some storm that had been waiting to toss him back into the water again. He fretted and turned for hours as Shelby snored heavily next to him.
But in the early hours of that January morning, his head heavy with fog and half-formed plans, he eventually drifted off. The crowd welcomed him back as one of their own, and the band nodded their recognition as they passed. Peter stood impassively, letting the event wash over him as the float rattled into view. On it, he saw the fresh gaggle of the young and old, the healthy and the sick, the deserving and the tragic. One by one they would announce themselves to him and then go on their final way. For some reason, for no reason, Peter supposed it didn't matter. With a muted interest, he saw that someone new, a woman, sat in the chair at the front of the float. It made sense, of course. Bedford was gone. He had given up his place of honor and joined the rest in whatever place they went to over the horizon when their time had come. Peter leaned forward and could see that the once beautiful woman's sun-kissed skin and brown eyes were now ravaged by disease, a condition of which she was not yet even aware. She probably wouldn't know for another year about that thing slowly turning her into a poor imitation of the vibrant being she'd once been. In the waking world, his fists balled up by his sides, and he began driving them into the mattress repeatedly. A tiny voice that was more like his son's than his own, wailing, "No! No!" Peter knew her long before she passed by him. He remembered meeting her on a random event 2,000 miles away from where they lived now. He knew her long before she waved. He could almost smell the hospital room where they'd held their son together for the first time. He knew her long before she said hello. As he watched Shelby pull away from him for the first time that year, Peter knew what Mrs. Bedford must have felt after the paramedics came for her husband. He knew what Clarence Wise's wife had felt when she saw what depression had done to her one and only. He knew what Cynthia Ryder's family had felt the morning after the accident. He knew what Henry would feel as he grew and the slivered memories of his mother would slip away from him. Peter felt alone, and the parade carried on into the night.